July 18, 1944. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood inside his cramped command post in Normandy, staring down at casualty reports that had begun to feel endless. The pages told a story no commander wanted to read. 6 weeks had passed since the landings. 6 weeks since Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of France. And 6 weeks of brutal, grinding combat that had bled the American army white in the Norman hedgerows. This was not a war of sweeping maneuvers or decisive breakthroughs. It was a war of yards, a war fought between ancient stone walls and earthen banks layered with roots and vegetation so thick that visibility often dropped to less than 10 yards. A man could die without ever seeing the enemy who killed him. Every narrow, sunken lane became a firing corridor. Every field became a fortress. Every hedgerow became a killing ground. Bradley's First Army had already suffered more than 40,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing. These were not abstract figures to him. They were sons pulled from farms in Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks, mechanics, students, and shop boys who had been thrown into a kind of fighting the American army had never faced before. They were dying slowly, field by field, hedge by hedge. The Germans were fighting desperately, but Bradley knew they were not the only problem. The true source of the catastrophe lay 6 miles to the east, in a city that was supposed to have fallen on the first day of the invasion. A city whose capture had been promised, guaranteed, and sworn to by Britain's most famous general. Caen, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had assured General Dwight Eisenhower that British forces would seize Caen on the day of the landings. Not later, not after consolidation, on the day itself. Caen was the key road junction in eastern Normandy, the gateway to open terrain beyond the beaches. If it fell quickly, Allied armor could fan out into France, maneuver freely, and deny the Germans the chance to contain the invasion. 6 weeks later, Caen was still in German hands. Montgomery's entire army was bogged down outside a city he had promised to take within hours. And because he was stuck, the Germans were free to concentrate their strength elsewhere. Every panzer division that was not engaged against the British was tearing into American units, trapped in the hedgerows to the west. While Montgomery stalled, Americans died. Bradley looked back at the reports. These were not acceptable losses for such minimal gains. He understood the brutal arithmetic of war, but this was different. This was avoidable. His men were paying the price for a failure that was not their own. What made it worse was that Montgomery was now claiming that his failure had never been a failure at all. He insisted it had been intentional, that drawing German armor toward Caen had been his plan from the beginning. Bradley knew better. This is the story of how Montgomery's broken promise at Caen nearly wrecked the Normandy invasion. How American soldiers paid in blood for British hesitation. And how George S. Patton ultimately had to save D-Day from a disaster Montgomery refused to admit even existed. Operation Overlord had been planned for more than 18 months. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history, a gamble on a scale never attempted before. British and Canadian forces were assigned the eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, with Caen as their primary objective. The city controlled the road network linking Normandy to Paris and beyond. Past Caen lay open, rolling terrain ideal for armored warfare. American forces were assigned the western beaches, Utah and Omaha, with the task of securing the Cotentin Peninsula and capturing the port of Cherbourg. This was vital for logistics, but it was secondary to the British breakout inland. The entire plan depended on speed. German panzer divisions were positioned across France. If the Allies became stuck on the beaches or contained near the coast, those armored forces could counterattack and drive them back into the sea. Montgomery understood the stakes, or at least claimed to. He assured Eisenhower that Caen would fall on the day of the landings, not the next day, not within a week, on that very day. British forces would push inland immediately and create space for maneuver. June 6, 1944. British and Canadian troops stormed ashore on the eastern beaches. The landings succeeded. Casualties were lighter than expected. By mid-morning, thousands of soldiers were moving inland. The British 3rd Infantry Division advanced south from Sword Beach toward Caen, only 6 miles away. The terrain ahead was relatively open. German forces in the area were thin and disorganized. The road to Caen was vulnerable, but Montgomery's plan contained a fatal flaw. He had prioritized caution over speed. British units paused to consolidate their beachhead. They waited for artillery to be landed. Supply dumps were organized. Command structures were tidied up. In another campaign, this might have been prudent. On D-Day, it was disastrous. By the afternoon, German reinforcements began to arrive. The 21st Panzer Division launched counterattacks between the British and Canadian sectors. They did not drive the Allies back into the sea, but they succeeded in halting the advance toward Caen. By nightfall, British forces were still several miles short of the city. The promise was already broken. Montgomery showed little concern. He told Eisenhower the delay was temporary. The advance would resume the next morning. Caen would fall within days. It did not. June 7th passed with British attacks repulsed. June 8th brought more of the same. On June 9th, progress remained negligible. Meanwhile, German commanders rushed reinforcements into Normandy. Panzer divisions streamed toward Caen, one after another. By June 10th, it was undeniable. Montgomery's plan had failed. Caen was not going to fall quickly. The British were locked into a grinding battle on the city's outskirts. The open terrain they had promised to seize remained firmly in German hands. And because the British were stuck, the American nightmare began. At German headquarters in France, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel faced a decision that would shape the entire Normandy campaign. His resources were limited. The Allied invasion had forced him to commit forces rapidly, but his greatest strength, his panzer divisions, could not be everywhere at once. He had to choose where to concentrate his armor. The British were pressing toward Caen in the east. The Americans, to the west, were grinding forward through the hedgerows in terrain that strangled tanks and favored the defender. Rommel studied the situation carefully. The British intention was unmistakable. Every major Allied attack in the east pointed toward Caen. If they broke through there, they would emerge into open country, perfect for armored exploitation. From Caen, the road to Paris lay open. A British breakthrough in that sector could unravel the entire German position in France. The American sector, by contrast, looked less dangerous. The bocage country of western Normandy was a nightmare for mobile warfare. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Fields were small, enclosed by massive earthen banks topped with centuries-old hedges and trees. Infantry advanced blindly into fortified positions they could not see. This was terrain where a determined defender could hold off a superior force for weeks. Rommel made his choice. He would concentrate his armor against the British at Caen. The 21st Panzer Division was already engaged there. He ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division to follow. Then came Panzer Lehr, one of Germany's most elite formations. The 1st SS Panzer Division soon joined them. These were not second-rate units. They were Germany's best-equipped, best-trained armored formations, filled with veteran crews and modern tanks. By mid-June, 7 German panzer divisions were concentrated around Caen. More than 500 tanks were positioned to stop Montgomery. These were the same divisions that could have counterattacked the American beaches while they were still vulnerable. They could have crushed Bradley's forces before they fully consolidated their lodgment. Instead, they were all locked in combat with the British. This concentration of German armor was exactly what Montgomery would later claim he had intended all along. He would argue that his attacks were never meant to break through, but to draw German panzer forces toward him and hold them there. In his version of events, every German tank fighting the British was a tank that could not be used against the Americans. But in June of 1944, Montgomery was not claiming this was his plan. He was attacking Caen again and again, each time trying to achieve the better breakthrough he had promised. His orders, his messages to Eisenhower, and his operational plans all pointed to the same goal: seize Caen and push inland. The British fought hard. Their soldiers showed courage and discipline under fire. But courage could not compensate for the reality of German defenses and missed opportunities. Each failed attack locked the British more firmly into a battle of attrition they had never intended to fight. Unintentionally, Montgomery created a shield for the American sector. German armor remained tied down in the east, unable to redeploy. But that shield came at a terrible cost. While British forces clashed with panzers around Caen, American soldiers were dying in a different kind of hell to the west. The bocage of Normandy was unlike anything the American army had trained for. Thousands of small fields were separated by earthen embankments, often 4 feet high, reinforced by tangled roots and thick vegetation. These hedgerows were centuries old, originally built as boundaries and defenses, and they functioned as natural fortifications. When American tanks attempted to climb over them, their bellies were exposed, turning them into easy targets for German anti-tank guns. A Sherman tank, powerful on open ground, became vulnerable and clumsy in the bocage. German infantry exploited this mercilessly. They hid machine guns to cover narrow lanes. Mortar teams fired from concealed positions. Anti-tank crews waited patiently for armor to expose itself. American infantry had to advance across open ground toward hedgerows they could not see through. Machine gun fire cut them down before they reached cover. If they reached the hedgerow, German defenders hurled grenades over the top. Even when one hedgerow was breached, another waited just 100 yards ahead. Air power, the Allies' greatest advantage, was largely neutralized. Thick vegetation concealed German positions. Close air support was difficult to coordinate in terrain where friendly and enemy forces were often separated by a single hedgerow. Artillery helped, but it could not destroy defenses that were built into the earth itself. Casualties mounted at an appalling rate. Entire companies lost half their strength in a matter of days. Regiments were shattered while fighting for objectives measured in yards. Divisions suffered thousands of casualties for gains that barely registered on a map. Bradley understood exactly what was happening. His army was being slowly bled because Montgomery had failed to deliver the breakthrough he promised. If Caen had fallen quickly, the front would have opened. American units could have maneuvered instead of grinding forward head-on. German attention would have been divided. Instead, the Germans knew the British were stuck. They could commit experienced infantry against the Americans and make every advance as costly as possible. By early July, American casualties exceeded 40,000. Nearly 1/3 of Bradley's assault divisions had suffered casualties. Replacement troops arrived daily, but they were inexperienced. They died learning lessons that should never have been necessary. On June 26, 1944, Montgomery launched Operation Epsom. 3 British divisions attacked west of Caen in an attempt to outflank and encircle the city. Montgomery committed his reserves. This was supposed to be the decisive blow. The attack opened with massive artillery support. Hundreds of guns fired in coordinated barrages. Infantry advanced behind creeping fire. Tanks followed close behind. On paper, the assault was overwhelming. The Germans were ready. Panzer divisions counterattacked skillfully. German tanks engaged British armor at long range, where their guns were most effective. Infantry held defensive positions stubbornly. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day. By the end of June, Operation Epsom had failed. The British had crossed the Odon River but could not exploit the breach. German counterattacks threatened to cut off the salient entirely. Montgomery ordered his forces to dig in. Caen was still in German hands. 3 weeks after D-Day, the primary objective of the British landings remained an impregnable fortress. Churchill was furious. British newspapers began openly questioning Montgomery's competence. Eisenhower met Montgomery in early July. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower demanded to know when Caen would fall. American forces could not remain trapped in the bocage indefinitely. Montgomery promised another offensive. This one, he claimed, would be decisive. It was called Operation Goodwood. Operation Goodwood was conceived as Montgomery's final answer to mounting pressure. He promised Eisenhower that this time, the weight of Allied firepower would shatter German defenses east of Caen. Heavy bombers would smash the German line. British armor would surge forward in overwhelming strength. The breakthrough that had been delayed for weeks would finally come. July 18, 1944. As Omar Bradley read casualty reports in his headquarters, the largest aerial bombardment yet used in support of ground operations began over eastern Normandy. More than 2,000 Allied bombers roared overhead and dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German positions near Caen. Entire villages vanished beneath clouds of dust and fire. German forward defenses were pulverized. Survivors were stunned, buried, or cut off from command. Behind the bombing, 3 British armored divisions advanced. More than 700 tanks rolled forward. For a few hours, it appeared Montgomery's promise might finally be fulfilled. British units pushed through the shattered ground. Reports sent to Eisenhower were optimistic. Montgomery claimed the German defenses were collapsing and that a decisive breakthrough was underway. But the bombing had not destroyed everything. German 88mm guns, hidden in villages and on reverse slopes, survived. Panzer units that had escaped the bombardment regrouped quickly. As British armor moved beyond the bombed zone, it entered carefully prepared killing grounds. Tanks were destroyed at long range. Columns stalled. Momentum evaporated. By the end of the first day, the advance had slowed to a crawl. Over the next 2 days, British forces continued to push forward, but each attempt met fierce resistance. German defenses bent, but did not break. More than 400 British tanks were destroyed or disabled. Casualties mounted rapidly. On July 20th, Montgomery called off Operation Goodwood. He declared it a success. British forces had taken portions of eastern Caen. German units had suffered losses. Montgomery portrayed the battle as a victory of attrition that had achieved its objectives. But Eisenhower understood the truth. Goodwood had failed to deliver the promised breakthrough. The British had paid an enormous price for minimal gains. Caen remained contested. The road to open terrain was still closed. Churchill was furious. He seriously considered removing Montgomery from command. Only political considerations and pressure from British leadership prevented it. Montgomery remained in position, but his credibility with Eisenhower was gone. 6 weeks after D-Day, it was clear the British were not going to break out at Caen. The burden would fall on the Americans. After Goodwood, Montgomery began telling a different story. He now claimed that breaking through at Caen had never been his goal. His true objective, he said, was to hold German panzer divisions in place. Every German tank fighting the British was one that could not be used against the Americans. According to Montgomery, this strategy had been deliberate from the beginning. This claim did not survive scrutiny. Montgomery's pre-invasion plans, his operational orders, and his repeated promises to Eisenhower all made clear that Caen was supposed to fall on the first day. He had intended a breakout. He had failed. Now he was reframing failure as foresight. The lie was politically brilliant. It protected Montgomery's reputation. It allowed him to claim credit for American success that had not yet even occurred, and it spared the Allied command from a public rupture between British and American leadership. Eisenhower could not openly contradict Montgomery without risking the unity of the alliance. Privately, however, he had already made his decision. Montgomery would no longer control American operations. If the breakout was going to happen, it would happen under American command. Bradley had been planning that breakout for weeks. Operation Cobra was designed to punch through the German line west of St. Lo. The plan called for an unprecedented concentration of air power. Heavy bombers would carpet bomb a narrow sector of the front, shattering German defenses. American infantry and armor would exploit the breach and surge into open terrain, beyond the bocage. Bradley had one major advantage. German armor remained tied down around Caen. 7 panzer divisions were locked in combat with the British. The Germans facing the Americans were largely infantry units without adequate armored support. If the line broke, there would be little to stop exploitation. American soldiers also adapted. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen devised a solution to the hedgerow problem by welding steel prongs salvaged from German beach obstacles onto the fronts of Sherman tanks. These Rhino tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. It was a simple innovation, but it transformed the battlefield. The breakout would require speed. Once the line was breached, American forces would have to move fast before German armor could redeploy from Caen. This demanded aggressive leadership. Bradley knew exactly who he needed: George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army was officially activated on August 1, 1944. But Patton had already been in Normandy, quietly preparing for the exploitation phase of Cobra. He studied maps obsessively. He planned routes, contingencies, and objectives far beyond the immediate battlefield. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra began. More than 1,500 heavy bombers and hundreds of medium bombers struck German positions near St. Lo. Thousands of tons of bombs obliterated a narrow strip of the front. German units were annihilated. Survivors were stunned and disorganized. Communications collapsed. American infantry attacked immediately. The German line cracked. By the evening, penetration had been achieved. Over the next 2 days, the breach widened. German counterattacks failed. The entire German defensive system in western Normandy began to collapse. On July 28, American forces emerged from the bocage into open country. The nightmare was over. Bradley committed his reserves. German attempts to shift panzer divisions from Caen came too late. Montgomery's failure had fixed them in place. The Germans could not respond effectively to the American breakthrough. By the end of July, the Normandy stalemate was broken. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army surged forward. Patton looked at his orders and immediately recognized they were obsolete. He was instructed to move west into Brittany to capture ports. But the German army was collapsing. Open roads lay before him. Victory was possible if he moved east, fast. Patton sent one corps west to satisfy the letter of his orders. The rest of Third Army went east toward Paris and the German frontier. Bradley quietly approved. Eisenhower was informed after the fact. Patton's advance was breathtaking. His units moved faster than any modern army had ever moved. German formations were outpaced, outflanked, and encircled. French towns were liberated before German units even realized they were under attack. Patton crossed rivers, seized crossings, and exploited every weakness. In 2 weeks, Third Army advanced farther than British forces had advanced in 2 months. By mid-August, Patton had reached the Seine. Montgomery responded by claiming credit. He told British media that American success was the result of his strategy at Caen, that he had created the conditions for victory. American generals were furious. Patton had succeeded despite Montgomery, not because of him. After the war, German generals confirmed the truth. They concentrated armor at Caen because the British were attacking there, not because they were being deceived. They believed Montgomery was trying to break through and failing. They were surprised by the speed and success of Cobra and Patton's exploitation. The numbers told the final story. American forces suffered more than 60,000 casualties in Normandy. Most of them incurred while trapped in the bocage during Montgomery's delay. Once mobility was restored, casualty rates dropped sharply. Montgomery promised to take Caen on D-Day. He failed after 6 weeks. Patton broke out of Normandy and advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. History softened the truth, but the reality remained. Montgomery failed at Normandy. Patton saved the invasion, and American soldiers paid the price for British caution.